And we can change this gradient feather to make it a little bit more overlapping like that. Then we move it like this. Or we can make it zero gradient, and then it's just a hard cut, swipe across, just like that. Welcome to Blender Frenzy. I am Justin, and this is what we created last time with just adding some text, and then we created a shader with transparency that would hide and reveal the text, and we have it kind of going in opposite directions. So the blue text is being hidden, and the orange text is being revealed. They're using the same thing, just opposite. And just to real quick show here what's happening, we have our empty that we can drag, and as we drag that, it hides and reveals this. I'm just going to hide this text here, and you can just see what's happening here. And actually, I'm going to unhide the plane here. Where's our plane? Okay, it's right here. So it's using the same texture, which is this, the blue texture. And I'm just going to scale this up here so you can kind of see that. And this, let's hide this text too. Pin this here so we can grab this empty. You can see what we have in this transparency. If we tab into this node group, you can see what we're doing. We have a gradient texture here that is using, it's just a black and white gradient that we've attached a mapping in a texture coordinate node to tell it that we're going to use this empty. And we're going to plug it in here, and then we can actually mess with the scale and stuff here like this. So a little bit more feather there. We can also mess with the location and stuff like that. This is what we created last time, so I'm not going to go into all of that this time, but just to show you that this is what it's using. It's a black and white mask, and wherever the mask is white, it's going to show our texture or our material, which is the blue, and wherever the black is, that's where it will be transparent. So I'll leave a link to this video somewhere where you can see it. Otherwise, you can go to blenderfrenzy.com. You can become a member of the Frenzy freebies. I'll leave this as a download where you can just download this straight away so you can start following along with this tutorial, and that's for free. So go and check it out there. But what we're going to do today, this is something that has been created just by using the straight text object. So we added text, and then we added a material to it, and then tied that material to an empty to adjust that gradient. It's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, but what we want to do is try to get this same effect into geometry nodes. And it's a little tricky because it doesn't work the same way, and I'll show you. So I'm going to hide these text again here. I'm also going to pull these in here so that I can just turn all of these off, except for our empty. I'm going to add in a plane just to show you don't have to use text for this because geometry nodes will replace all of that with whatever we plug in. So let's go to geometry node editor. We're going to unpin this, of course, and click new. And then here are the geometry nodes. I'm going to select these and then scale them out so we have a little bit more room. Okay, so we have the cube being plugged into the group input, which is then being plugged into the output, and that's what we're seeing, the same thing. So if we sever this, we can see nothing, and that's what we're going to replace. Shift A and add in string to curves. If you have the node wrangler, then Alt Shift and click, and that will plug that in. I'm sure you know what the node wrangler add-on is, but edit, preferences, add-ons, node wrangler, and enable that. Gives you lots of different node features, but for this one, let's look at it. So if we enter something here, a string, it's just a string of characters, so I'm just going to say geometry nodes here, and that is what we can see here. I'm going to pin this here, so if we select something else, this doesn't go away. Now we just have an outline here, so we want to fill this, so Shift A and fill curve, plug that in there. And then the next thing we want to do in order for the empty that we have to affect that, we just need to add in the same material. And the way you do that in geometry nodes is Shift A and set material. Boom. Oh, well, half boom because we need to select blue, and then that's full boom, and boom. Boom, full boom, boom. And then now the empty affects our new geometry nodes text, and that's because it's actually not affecting the text, it's affecting the material. And so anything with our blue material, any object that we add to the scene that has our blue material, say we add in a monkey, And then with the monkey, we can add in that blue. Same thing will happen. And we don't have to do anything extra. The object is still there. It's just invisible, just like all the other ones. Okay, so this is okay. And right now we have our same animation, and it's going to be affecting it the same exact way. And we're going to go ahead and get rid of these keyframes. So the way we bring this empty in here is pretty easy. We just click and drag straight away and plop it in here. And there we go. It's empty here. And we can take this geometry, and if we plug it in, it's going to replace our selection. So we don't want to replace it. We want to actually join it. So let's pull out here and let go, and then we can click join geometry, and then plug this one in here, and then plug this one in here. And now we have both of them. So let's bring in a transform node. Transform geometry, plug it in here, and let's try to move it. Okay, well, we can't move it. And that is because this is actually still the empty that we're seeing here, the real empty. In order to see empties within geometry nodes, since they're not technically geometry, you have to click as instance. And you can see this says output the entire object as a single instance. This allows instancing non-geometry object types, such as empties. So click that, and now you can see our empty is right here. But this is selecting everything. If I select our text, it will also select our empty because this instance is part of this here. This is a completely different thing now. So now that it's inside here, we can go ahead and hide this one. Oh, actually, we have to keep this one enabled, but we can keep this one hidden. And now when we move this, you can see we are moving the empty instance. But we have a problem, and that is it is not affecting our gradient at all. And this is where the tricky part comes in, because we have to now emulate that gradient movement with calculations. And this is because if you notice when we move the empty in geometry nodes, it's not moving the origin point. So if we unhide our empty here for a second and select it, if I select this and I click out, you can see this orange dot here. That's the origin point. Now in Blender, texture coordinates, so let's pull, I'm going to drag another one out here. We're going to use this as the shader editor, and let's close these with N. And we want to select our, oh, this is pinned for some reason, I don't know. We want to select our text and then blue, and then let's go ahead and pin this. Okay. So let's go into our transparency here. This texture coordinate, that's what's using the empty. Texture coordinates in Blender are based off of the origin point. If I come over to our text, and remember, geometry nodes is a modifier. So if we go to the modifiers tab, here's our modifier, and it's on our plane. So if I disable this modifier, you can see it's just a blue plane. And that's why the origin point is still right here, because that is the origin point of our original object. When I move the empty in 3D space without geometry nodes, it's moving the origin, and that's what affects that gradient. But if I enable geometry nodes modifier again, when I move it as an instance, it's not moving that origin, so nothing is happening. And so that is why we have to do some more calculations to emulate that movement of that origin. So let's hide our empty again. Now I know you can do it through attributes, but that will be in the next video. So we're going to use drivers, and it is very simple, especially if you have this set up just like this. So we've got our geometry nodes over here, and we've got our shader editor over here. This is our texture, our blue texture. And remember this location here, this mapping node, at the beginning, we said that we can adjust this. This will adjust the placement and the rotation and the scale of our gradient texture here. So we can use a driver to link these two together. And the simplest way to do this is right-click, copy as new driver, right-click, and paste driver. There we go. And now, when I move this, you can see something is happening. It's just happening in the opposite direction. So that's not good, but this is an easy fix, especially in geometry nodes, because we will just add a calculation to invert it. Now you can also add it over here as well. Let's pull out this and make some more room here. I've also unhid the plane so we can see the effect a little better. Now we're going to delete this driver, We're going to add in a calculation here before it hits the location of the gradient. So if we Shift A and add in a combine XYZ here, and then we plug this in here, we can add the driver to this. So now we can copy his new driver and we can paste this here on this one instead. Now when we move this, you can see the same thing is happening, but now we have a little bit more flexibility. In fact, we can unplug this at any time and get our original values back, but we can also plug it into the rotation and have that affect the rotation. Of course, it's on the X, so you can't really see that, but we can affect the scale with that as well. And if we add more nodes, we can move it around, and this is a lot more flexible rather than continuing to delete and re-add drivers. So let's plug this back in here. And now what we can do is we can add in a calculation. So once this moves, it affects this driver. And then we want to feed it and tell it to flip or invert here before it gets to our mapping node. And that's pretty easy. If we click and drag this out and let go, we can type in multiply. And we want the vector math multiply. And then we'll have to plug that into the location here. Now it's multiplying it by 0, meaning it's going to be 0 and nothing is going to happen. So if we move it, nothing happens. But if we multiply this by -1 on all of these, now when we move this, you can see it is moving the same direction our empty moves. And that's great. But right now you can also see that it's moving faster than our empty is moving. It's not moving along with our empty. And that's because our scale we had messed with earlier is at 0.43. So we need to make this scale at 1. And now when we move the empty, it should move exactly along with it. But it's a little bit offset. So we want to move this line directly in the center of the empty. So just like we were doing here, we multiplied it by -1 to invert it. Now, since it's offset, we can just add or subtract a little bit from here so that it lines up here. So we can just duplicate this multiply node, plug it here, and instead of multiply, we want to say add, and then we can adjust these to line up where we think most or best fits the empty space here. So something like that is fine. And now when we move our empty, you can see it lines up perfectly. So that's how drivers work, and they're pretty powerful, but this is still a bit confusing. So having to go in here and try to figure out, oh, which one of these moves this and which goes here. One of the most powerful things with geometry nodes is we can make it much cleaner with inputs, where we can just have all of our inputs in our geometry modifier and just modify it from here. So let's clean up our geometry node scene here just a bit. So this is, not that it needs it so much, but if I select both of these, press Control J, it will make a little frame here, and we can F2 to rename this empty and gradient. That's that, and then we can move them all together, and this will be our text. All right, and here's our group input, and the nice thing about this is that we can take the input node at the bottom here and plug it into whatever we want an input to be. So in this case, we want our translation because that is what is moving our empty. So we plug it right in there, and now we have a new translation, and you can see an XYZ translation input that we can slide. But you can see if I slide it, it doesn't affect the gradient, and that's because the driver is specifically attached to this field. It is not attached to any other field. So we actually have to do the same thing that we did, and we just replace this driver here by right-clicking and copying a new driver from here and then pasting it here. And now this slider will slide here. Now we don't even have to have geometry nodes or the shader editor open for this to work. We can see, oh, hey, look at that. We can move the translation. And don't mind the yellow highlighter here. It just whenever I'm sliding these sliders, for some reason it just pops wherever it wants to go. It's kind of a little bit of a glitch, so sorry about that. So that's cool, but we can even rename these here. So if I pull this up, and in our geometry node space, if I press N to bring up the panels and go to group, we can see our inputs here. And so if I select my translation, we can rename it to empty move. And there we go. And it says empty move is a lot more intuitive now. And then we can even give a tooltip. This moves the empty. And now if I hover over this, you can see this moves the empty. So it's really, really powerful, really cool to be able to do the inputs like this. But let's make this even more powerful. Let's just say that we want to be able to move this here and create an offset or extend the gradient out past the empty in either direction. Well, we can do this by adding another driver here to control this. But if you notice, there isn't anything that I can tie it to. We already have our translation on the X, Y, and Z for our empty, which we're only using the X, but that is taken up. So I don't have anything else that I could plug my input into in order to create a driver. Well, the awesome thing that I've recently learned is you don't have to. You can actually create a socket by itself that's not connected to anything. So if I come over here and I press the plus button here, I've just now created an input all by itself. And it will copy or duplicate whatever you have selected at the time. In this case, it was the empty move. So I'm just going to say extend gradient. That's what we'll call this one. We don't need a tooltip, but now I have 3 fields here that I can use for drivers. So if I do the same thing, let's duplicate this one here. We're going to do the same thing we did to have more flexibility. Instead of adding the drivers here, I'm going to add them here and plug it in to here. So right click, and it really does depend on which one you right click on. So I'm right clicking on the top one, which is the X location. So right click, copy as new driver, and then on the X, paste that. So now we have this slider here to extend that out, and then we have the empty move. So if I wanted this to extend out just a little bit further than the empty, now we have that offset. And again, we can pull these down. We don't even need to look at those. We have these 2 here, and this gives a lot of really cool flexibility. So I'm going to do a couple more things. First, I want to clean this up a little bit. We're not using the Y and the Z locations. So what I'm going to do is we're going to just separate these here. Let's close this and then make some more room here. So the translation, we're only using the X location. So what we can do is we can actually bring in a combine XYZ over here and plug it in here and just use the X location. Now, we do have a mismatch now. So this purple and this gray buttons, they're different. So the gray are just single values. Vectors are a combination of 3 values. If I hover over this, you can see they're 18900, that's 3 values, that's the X, Y, and the Z. So that's why this is combined, because if you read it from left to right, it's combining X, Y, and Z into one socket and plugging that in. So if we go the opposite way, it's in effect separating them. So we've separated the X out only. So what we can do is we open this back up again, go to our empty move, and this is now a value, but it's specifically it's going to be a float value, and that just means a number with a decimal point. And now we've cleaned that up. We've gotten rid of the X and the Y locations. It's just 1 here. But again, because we've changed this, it's not affecting anything, so we have to replace that driver. So copy as new driver, and that was this one, paste driver. Okay, so now we have our empty move back up and running here, just that single field. And with this one, we don't have anything to plug in or change. All we have to do is change this to a float, and then that's just 1 as well. But again, of course, copy as new driver and paste driver. All right, so we have this. We have our move, our extend gradient. You could also say gradient offset, or however you, actually, you know what, that's probably gradient offset, probably makes more sense, because it's not just extending it, you can contract it too. Okay, but we can do the same exact thing with one more slider, and that is the feather. And remember, that was with this scale here. But we've got to be careful because we can't do it on this scale, because if we do, just like this, then when we move our empty, it's going to move it in a way that is not aligned with our empty anymore. So it's going much faster than our empty. Or if we scale it higher, it's going to flip it and, well, go slower and all of that stuff. So we need to keep this at 1. So in order to get around this, all we have to do is add in another mapping node right after it. We can put that to 0. So make sure everything is 0 and then the scale is at 1. Now when we adjust this scale, it's going to be in alignment with this because it's taking everything here as is, and then the next step it's scaling it. So now if I move the empty, it's moving it along with the empty. Because again, all of this calculation is taking place first instead of this being mixed in with all of these calculations. So it's taking all of this and then it's scaling the feather. And same thing with the offset. So I can still do the offset. I can still move it just fine. And then we can scale that feather. But of course, we want to do a combine XYZ here. Plug that in. And then we got to add our driver, which means we need another input. So plus, and that is going to be a float. This is going to be called our gradient feather. Right click, copy as new driver, and paste that driver. Okay, well, it's 0 now, so we can just scale it to how we want. So we have a lot more power now with all of this put together. But if I take this gradient feather and I go to the negatives, it flips it. Well, let's say you didn't want this to happen. Let's say you didn't want this to go infinite into the positive or the negative, but you want it to stop somewhere. Well, you can do it with the min and the max values here. So you can also set a default, which is really cool. Default can be 0, that's fine. But I don't want this to go lower than 0. So the minimum here is going to be 0. Of course, I have to make this 0 here too first. And now, no matter how much I drag this slider, it's not going to go past 0. And then let's see, I can keep going to, yeah, I mean, I could stop it at probably, where do we actually see a difference? I mean, you can pretty much go this forever, but we can just say 50. We'll stop that at 50. So this will be, we'll have to put that here too, 50. And so it's from 50 to 0. You won't even need to use that much there. But now we've got the scale of the feather like we want. We have the offset and we have the move. Awesome. So then what we can do now is make sure you're saving it, of course. And let's hide the plane and turn off our overlays. And look at what we have here. Look at that. So we can make it to where we can scale that feather as much as we want. Let's not do an offset on that here. Let's just put it here. So it can be a really tight feather, or it can be a really broad scaling feather. Oh, that goes this way. We have to go something like that. Kind of eases out and eases in. And so essentially you've just created your own modifier plugin with a material that fades stuff in and out of visibility. So if we wanted to apply this to something else, let's say again we bring in, add in our monkey, and then we can say, let's make a new material. So we'll just do a new material. We can leave that at the principled shader. We'll just make another, whatever color here. But let's unpin this so we can see our new material. So what we can do here is add in our group transparency because we've made a group called transparency with our calculations and stuff, and plug that into the alpha if you're using this principled shader. And then with our geometry nodes modifier here, we can pull this, and you can see it's affecting it. But of course, on our this one, let's just pin that. Select here. We need to make sure that the options here are settings. Blend mode is alpha blend. And I talked about this last time in the last video too. So now you can see it's affecting it the same way that it's affecting our text. So if I turn off those overlays and I move my empty, da 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 da, and that looks kind of terrible. And I think it's because, bring this back up, it has show backface on here. If I uncheck that, there we go. Now we can see. And we can still, yeah, that's much better. And that's actually probably a good idea for the text too if we haven't done that. So the blue text, we uncheck show backface, and that might give us better results here. But we can, again, mess with the feather, zero feather. Zero feather actually means there's nothing. So technically 50 is zero feather. Yeah, so that's technically zero feather. So to make it more intuitive, I suppose we could make a calculation here. Can we add in a multiply and then just make this -1? That'll flip it. We don't want to flip it. I think maybe a map range. I think if we do a converter map range, this is a vector, so we need to change this to vector before we plug it in here. Okay, so right now it's stopping at 1. That's why all the way up here it doesn't have any effect. So if we go to 1 and then go to 0, it's stopping at 1. So what we can do is keep this from 0 to 1, and then we can go from 0 to 50. Okay, so that means from 0 it's nothing, and then 1 is technically 50. But we want to flip that. So we want actually 1 to be 0 and then 0 to be 50. So now we have it going the opposite way where it's a little bit more intuitive. Now 0, this is technically 0 feather. I mean, it's not really 0 feather. We could probably go to 100, and then that would be probably the sharpest line. And then 1 would be like complete feather. So let's do that and set the max here. Instead of 50, we'll set the max to 1 on our slider. So now we have a little bit more finicky of a slider. We have to maybe hold shift and do it, but that's a lot more intuitive. So 1 is complete feather and 0 is no feather. Awesome. And then, of course, we can hide it, and we don't need Suzanne anymore. Go on the top, and now we have our empty move with a clean cut or a feathered fade out of our text. But I know you're also asking, well, how do we create this effect that we did before with one text going in and one text coming out like this? How do we create that in geometry nodes? Well, that's pretty easy. So let's pull this up. And here's our text. We just need to, so let's get Shift D to duplicate all of this. And then let's pull this. We're going to this will be the blue text, and this will be the orange text. And all we have to do is plug this in here. Change this to orange. So now it's working, but of course it's the same. It's just changing. So this is how you can change color between the two. But it's using the same string. So we're just going to say is awesome. So now we have this as it slides. And the reason this is working straight away is because in the orange material, if we come over here and we make sure we select, okay, so that's fine. We can select our orange material and it's just opposite. So if you look at the blue we have transparent is on the top, the blue emission color is in the bottom, and if we just swap those to where the emission is in the top and the transparent's in the bottom, then you get the opposite effect. And we can change this gradient feather to make it a little bit more overlapping like that. Then we move it like this. Or we can make it zero gradient, and then it's just a hard cut, swipe across, just like that. And of course we can put our keyframes on them. So this will be, we'll say that this is here. Let's do a little bit of overlap here. .996. You really have to hold shift down when you do that. But yes, do this keyframe, and then 40. We can have this all the way over here. Another keyframe, and we have something that looks like this. What we can also do here is to make it even easier, so we can change this text. We can take this and make these strings. We can pull these out and plug these in here so that we can just type out here. And over here now we have new string. If we pull this down, we have 2 new strings. And we can just call this string blue and string orange. And let's pull these up because I want them to be on the top. So whatever we plug in here now will be in here. So Blender Frenzy. So now we have that. So there you go. This is how you can use inputs and drivers to create a cool looking effect like this. But you can see we're still using keyframes that we've placed manually. So this is not taking full advantage of the procedural way that we can actually manipulate this in geometry nodes. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. Instead of using keyframes, what we'll do is we'll create calculations based on the length of the text to make our hide and reveal fit anything that we type in here. So that'll be in the next video, so stay tuned and you'll see me in the next one. You can find this video and a whole lot more by going to my new website, blenderfrenzy.com, where you can access lots of free and members-only content, including extra tutorials, downloads, assets, blend files, Q&A live streams, and much more. Signing up helps support me, which in turn gives you more Blender content, so head on over to blenderfrenzy.com and become a member today.